Story 1. The Rain at Jetavana. The rain at Jetavana fell with a heavy, rhythmic persistence that seemed to dissolve the very boundary between the damp earth and the heavy sky. Inside the small wooden cell, a seeker named Anuradha sat with crossed legs, his breath shallow and irregular as he watched the slow accumulation of moisture on the stone floor. His mind did not rest in the present dampness, but leaped forward to the dry months of winter, constructing elaborate defenses against a hunger that had not yet arrived. This internal theater of survival was his constant companion, an endless series of mental rehearsals designed to ward off the ghost of deprivation. He watched his own consciousness construct these fragile structures of safety, recognizing how each thought was a desperate attempt to anchor an unstable self in a shifting world. The anxiety he carried was not a response to actual danger, but a chronic habit of anticipation, a structural defect in his perception that transformed the peaceful silence of the forest into a threat. He observed the subtle tension in his jaw, the way his shoulders braced against an imaginary blow, realizing that this physical rigidity was the somatic shadow of his psychological resistance. Every drop of rain became a symbol of impermanence, a silent reminder that the self he sought to protect was as fluid and temporary as the mud dissolving outside his door. His intellect tried to analyze the sensation, categorizing his fear into neat doctrines and philosophical definitions. Yet this very conceptualization was another defense mechanism, a subtle strategy to avoid feeling the raw vulnerability of the moment. He saw how his mind clung to these intellectual labels as a shield, preferring the sterile comfort of theory to the terrifying intimacy of direct experience. The silent Buddha sat under the distant Bodhi tree, representing a state of non-clinging that Anuradha found both deeply attractive and profoundly threatening to his ego. To let go of the anxiety meant to let go of the planner, the controller, the central character in his internal drama. He realized that his suffering was not caused by the external cycle of samsara, but by his internal resistance to its inevitable flow. The cyclic nature of his worry was a self-fulfilling loop, where the fear of future anxiety generated the very tension he sought to avoid. He sat quietly, allowing the damp air to fill his lungs, noticing how the urge to control the future began to lose its grip when there was no longer an attempt to run from the present discomfort. The silence deepened, not because the rain had stopped, but because the inner noise of preparation had finally begun to quiet down. This cessation was not a sudden illumination, but a gradual thinning of the ego's boundary, a dissolving of the false dichotomy between the observer and the observed. Every conceptual construct he had built over decades of anxious striving began to appear like a mirage in the heat of midday, shimmering with the illusion of substance yet possessing no core. He examined the sensation of waiting itself, dissecting it into its constituent parts of muscular constriction, rapid cardiac pulse, and a frantic mental narration that sought to explain the discomfort. By refusing to feed the narrator with new scenarios of catastrophe, the somatic energy of the fear was left without a story to sustain it. It became merely warmth, pressure, and movement within the spacious field of his awareness. This shift from narrative to sensation was the critical pivot of his liberation, showing him that the prison of samsara was not a place but a way of processing reality. He felt a profound release in his chest, as if a tightly coiled spring had finally spent its energy and relaxed into stillness. The dirt floor beneath him felt solid, supporting his weight without demanding any justification for his existence. In this space of unadorned presence, the fear of tomorrow lost its architecture, collapsing into the simple, uncontested reality of the immediate breath. He understood then that peace was not the absence of change, but the absolute surrender of the need to control the path of the river. The storm outside continued, but the storm within had run its course. Story 2. The Well of Kosala. The dusty trail winding through the dry plains of Kosala was quiet under the long shadows of late afternoon. Yet the mind of the traveling merchant Jivaka was a chaotic marketplace of voices. His thoughts were consumed by the 5 carts of silk currently crossing the northern passes, each imagining of a broken axle or a bandit raid sending a sharp spasm of heat through his abdomen. He was not merely a man walking on a dirt road. He was a fragile vessel carrying an immense weight of imagined futures. This internal division was his habitual mode of existence, a constant refusal to inhabit the ground beneath his feet while his consciousness projected itself miles away to guard a wealth that was fundamentally beyond his control. He noticed how his mind constructed these elaborate anxiety loops as a form of magical thinking, believing that the act of worrying somehow purchased safety for his distant cargo. He recognized this pattern as a deep-seated attachment to his identity as a successful provider, a mental construct that required constant validation word through external accumulation. The thought of failure was not merely a loss of coin, but a threat to his very sense of self-worth, triggering an existential panic that his ego attempted to pacify with ceaseless calculation. As he paused beside an abandoned stone well, he looked down into the dark, still water, seeing only his own troubled reflection staring back through the gloom. He realized that the merchant he desperately tried to protect was a fictional character, an accumulation of memories and projections that had no reality in the present moment. The teaching of the silent sage under the nearby trees occurred to him, not as an intellectual theory, but as a direct challenge to his current agony. The freedom he sought lay not in the safety of his silks, but in the dissolution of the merchant who owned them. He began to examine the very concept of security, recognizing that his frantic efforts to prevent hypothetical disasters were actually the primary source of his present torment. The mind was constantly reacting to its own self-generated projections, mistaking the internal images of ruin for actual circumstances. By closely observing this cognitive feedback loop, he noticed how each wave of anxiety was accompanied by a subtle physical desire to flee the current location, a somatic urge that kept him in a state of perpetual migration. This microanalysis revealed that the fear was not a monolithic block of suffering, but a series of rapid, discrete events. First, the visual memory of loss, then the tightening of the solar plexus, followed by a desperate intellectual search for solutions. When he allowed these components to exist without attempting to synthesize them into a personal tragedy, their cohesion shattered. The fear was no longer an absolute truth, but an impermanent arrangement of biological signals. He felt a profound shift in his relationship with his own thoughts, transitioning from the helpless victim of a psychological storm to the vast space in which the storm played out. He took a deep, slow breath of the cool evening air, letting his awareness expand beyond the narrow confines of his financial calculations. The distance between the past and the future collapsed, leaving only the dry earth, the fading light, and the quiet rhythm of his heart. The urgent voices in his head began to lose their substance, transforming into mere shadows that dissolved into the twilight. He saw that the wealth he sought to defend was not his silk, but this vast, spacious awareness that could hold both gain and loss with equal equanimity. Each step forward on the dusty path became lighter, not because the future had become certain, but because the need for certainty had been abandoned. The quiet of the Kosala plains settled into his bones, and he walked on as a man who owned nothing, yet lacked nothing. The horizon grew dim, and the road itself seemed to guide his feet without any conscious direction. In this quietude, the chronic cycles of his mind were finally broken, replaced by the vast space of the present. Story 3. The Palaces of Rajagriha. The dry heat of Magadha pressed against the high stone terraces of the palace at Rajagriha, warping the air until the distant hills of Vulture Peak seemed to tremble like a mirage. On this elevated terrace, a senior administrator named Bharata paced the polished granite, his mind a complex loom weaving infinite configurations of state security and taxation registers. He was burdened not by the tasks before him, but by the terrifying fluidity of the kingdom's future, constantly calculating the yields of barley and the loyalty of distant border governors. To Bharata, every unpredictable event was a potential fissure in the fortress of his orderly life, and his intellect functioned as a relentless defense mechanism designed to predict and neutralize every possible deviation. He watched this mental vigilance with a cold, clinical detachment, noting how his consciousness could never rest in the stillness of the afternoon, but had to continuously feed the illusion of his own indispensability. His anxiety was a sophisticated labyrinth built of numbers, political alliances, and strategic precautions. Yet beneath this intellectual armor lay a deep-seated dread of the silent void. The chronic cycle of his worry was not triggered by external instability, but by his own profound resistance to the fundamental truth of change. He recognized how his body accommodated this defense: the shallow chest breathing, the perpetual narrowing of his eyes as if scanning the horizon for an invisible enemy. Every ledger he compiled was a monument to this defiance, a desperate attempt to freeze the flowing river of time into static figures. He realized that his mind treated the natural flow of the universe as a personal insult, a chaotic force that must be tamed through sheer willpower. A quiet monk from the nearby bamboo grove had once passed him without speaking, yet the serene posture of that wanderer had left a disturbing impression on the minister. It was an invitation to a state of being where nothing was defended, where the ego had surrendered its claim to authorship. Bharata began to microanalyze the arising of his anxiety, observing how a simple report of a minor border skirmish would immediately cascade into a mental simulation of total collapse. He saw that the terror was not in the news itself, but in the speed with which his mind transformed a local incident into a global catastrophe to justify its chronic state of alertness. By refusing to participate in this hyper-vigilant narrative, he forced his awareness to remain with the raw physical sensations of the panic. He felt the tightness in his throat, the sudden chill on his skin, and the rapid thumping of his pulse against his ribs. He sat down upon the warm stone floor, allowing these physical reactions to occur without classifying them as good or bad. Without the fuel of his elaborate mental scenarios, the somatic energy of the fear had no foundation, dissolving slowly like salt in a bucket of warm water. He looked out at the vast valley of Magadha with new eyes, realizing that the kingdom had never been his to save or protect. The illusion of control fell away from him like a heavy ceremonial robe, exposing a profound and spacious vulnerability. He perceived that the true empire was not built on stone and obedience, but on this interior freedom that remained untouched by victory or defeat. The sunset painted the hills in shades of purple and gold, and for the first time in his life, he did not try to measure the day's yield. He simply watched the light fade, his breath rhythmic and deep, fully integrated into the silence that was always there. His mind no longer sought to resolve the future into a predictable pattern, accepting the absolute fluidness of the kingdom's destiny. The endless columns of figures that had once defined his reality appeared as mere etchings on water, vanishing as soon as they were made. He felt a vast, peaceful emptiness expanding within, a silence that held the entirety of his life without the need to explain a single breath. This internal vastness was his sanctuary, a quiet realm where the illusions of duty and inheritance dissolved into the cool evening breeze. Story 4. The Potter of Savatthi. The rhythmic turning of the wooden potter's wheel in the village of Savatthi was the only sound in the cool hours of the early morning. Yet the mind of the young artisan Soma was loud with a bitter, relentless noise. His hands shaped the moist red clay with instinctive grace, but his inner eye was fixed on the grand market square, visualizing the superior vessels created by Kunda, the master potter. He saw in his imagination the wealthy patrons praising Kunda's smooth glaze and intricate designs, and each imagined word of approval for his rival was like a sharp pebble scratching the delicate wall of his self-esteem. This chronic habit of comparison was his constant cage, a structural distortion in his awareness that transformed his own beautiful work into a source of deep shame and inadequacy. He watched this internal mechanism operate with a sense of helpless exhaustion, recognizing how his mind was trapped in an endless cycle of evaluation, perpetually measuring his worth against the achievements of another. The anxiety he experienced was not caused by his skill or his poverty, but by the constant projection of an idealized other who possessed the ultimate validation he craved. He noticed the physical manifestation of this mental loop, the constriction in his chest, the way his hands shook slightly as they tried to force the clay into perfect symmetry. Every pot he shaped became an argument in his defense, a desperate plea for recognition that was ultimately directed at his own internalized critic. A group of yellow-robed disciples of the Buddha had passed his workshop earlier, carrying their begging bowls with an effortless simplicity that made his artistic ambitions feel like a heavy weight of iron chains. He saw that their peace came from the complete absence of a self to be measured, while his own life was a series of frantic performances designed to prove an identity that did not exist. Soma began to closely observe the micro-movements of his envy. Tracking the precise moment a thought of Kunda's success would trigger a somatic contraction in his stomach. He watched how his mind attempted to defend his ego by finding flaws in Kunda's character or work, constructing fragile rationalizations that only reinforced his sense of separation. By refusing to indulge these defensive narratives, he left the raw sensation of envy bare and undefended. He allowed the feeling of inadequacy to occupy his awareness without trying to fix it, rename it, or escape from it through harder labor. The tightness in his chest began to soften, revealing itself as merely a pattern of heat and pressure that did not define his capability. His hands on the rotating clay grew steady, no longer trying to force the material into a rigid shape of competition, but collaborating with the nature of the earth and the motion of the wheel. The pot under his fingers blossomed into a simple, functional beauty, reflecting the quiet mind that had brought it into being. He understood then that his worth was not a score to be tallied against another's, but the natural expression of his own unique presence. The morning sun illuminated his dusty workshop with a soft, impartial light, shining equally on his simple bowls and Kunda's elegant vases. He smiled at the mud on his hands, his heart quiet as the cycle of comparison finally ceased its spinning. The social hierarchies that had once dominated his thoughts now seemed as arbitrary as the shapes formed by dust in a whirlwind. He saw that Kunda, too, was bound to the same wheel of striving, chasing the approval of patrons who were themselves locked in a struggle for status. To seek peace by being better than another was to build a house on shifting sand, where every wave of public opinion could wash away the fragile foundation. By dropping the yardstick of comparison, he stepped outside the arena of conflict entirely. In this boundless freedom of non-comparison, his labor became an act of pure devotion, a sacred communion with the earth and the present moment that needed no approval to justify its existence. The wheel spun smoothly, reflecting the stillness of his heart. Story 5. The River at Varanasi. The thick morning fog hung low over the sacred waters of the Ganga at Varanasi, obscuring the opposite shore in a soft, silver shroud. Sitting upon the damp stone steps of the ghat, a solitary seeker named Sundari wrapped her coarse ochre robe tightly around her shivering frame. Her gaze was fixed on the river, but her inner landscape was a turbulent flood of ancient memories, each wave carrying the heavy debris of a past she could neither alter nor escape. She was tormented by the vivid recollections of her former life of luxury and vanity, where her worth had been measured by the adoration of suitors and the brilliance of her jewels. Each past mistake was a ghost that haunted her silence, whispering that she was forever stained and unworthy of the peace she now sought. She watched this internal mechanism of self-punishment with a quiet terror, realizing how her mind actively cultivated this guilt as a bizarre shield against the vast emptiness of the present. This painful habit was her deepest identification, a stubborn belief that her true essence was synonymous with her historical errors. To let go of her shame meant to let go of the only self-image she had left, leaving her completely undefended in a universe of shifting shadows. She observed the physical weight of this guilt in her body, the constant ache in her shoulders, the constriction around her heart that made every breath feel like an act of labor. She saw that her mind clung to these painful memories because they provided a familiar, albeit agonizing, boundary for her identity. The teaching of the Enlightened One echoed through her awareness like a distant temple bell, pointing to a consciousness that was as vast and unblemished as the open sky. She began to dissect her regret under the light of this awareness, observing how each painful memory was merely a collection of mental images, physical sensations, and conceptual labels. By refusing to weave these fragments into a tragic personal history, she stripped them of their power to define her. She sat quietly, letting the cool mist settle on her face, noticing how the urgency of her guilt began to dissolve when she no longer tried to argue with her past. The river flowed before her, carrying away the ashes of yesterday without offering any comment, a silent testament to the beauty of perpetual renewal. She understood then that her true nature was not the mud at the bottom of the stream, but the clear water that washed it away. The sun began to pierce the heavy mist, casting a golden path across the ripples of the Ganga. She watched a single lotus leaf float down the river, unattached and unburdened, drifting effortlessly through the morning light. Her heart felt lighter, not because her history had changed, but because she had stopped trying to carry it on her back. In the spaciousness of this new morning, the ghosts of her past dissolved into the warmth of the sun, leaving only the clean, quiet rhythm of the immediate breath. The river flowed, and she flowed with it, a peaceful witness to the birth of a new day. She began to perceive the true nature of her guilt as a structural artifact of the ego, a defensive mechanism that used the past to build a safe, predictable, and finite identity. The ego preferred a damaged, guilt-ridden definition of itself to the boundless, formless reality of simple being. By examining this dynamic with perfect clarity, she saw through the ultimate falseness of her narrative of unworthiness. The burden of guilt was not a solid object she was destined to carry, but a series of mental shadows she was actively maintaining. When she ceased this cognitive preservation, the space within her expanded, revealing a quiet sanctuary of peace that had always been present beneath her sorrow. In this stillness, her identity ceased to be defined by what was lost, transforming into a spacious field where everything was embraced. The vastness of the river became the vastness of her own soul. Story 6. The Woods of Mahavana. The ancient canopy of the Mahavana forest near Vesali was thick and impenetrable, casting the forest floor into a perpetual, moss-colored twilight even during the brightest hours of the day. Sitting motionless against the roots of a giant sal tree, a former hunter named Aniya listened to the deep silence of the woods, his body perfectly still, but his nervous system coiled like a spring. His ears were hypersensitive to every crackle of a dry leaf or rustle of a fern, and each sound triggered a quiet cascade of survival reflexes in his chest. He was no longer a pursuer of beasts. He had laid down his bow to seek the timeless peace of the forest, yet the primal habit of his training kept him in a state of constant, exhausting alertness. His mind was a hyperactive radar, constantly translating the natural movements of the wild into a series of personal threats. This chronic cycle of anxiety was a deep-seated mechanism of bodily projection, where his subconscious fear of his own physical mortality was cast outward onto the peaceful forest. He watched this cognitive error operate with intense interest, noting how his ego used the fear of external predators to avoid facing the deeper, inescapable reality of decay and death. The anxiety he carried was not a response to an actual tiger in the brush, but his own resistance to the fundamental vulnerability of his physical existence. He felt the tension in his thighs, the way his hands curled into fists, and the rapid, shallow breath that prepared him for a phantom battle. Every shadow became a threat, a silent reminder that the body he sought to defend was temporary, destined to dissolve back into the earth that supported him. He remembered the teaching of the great physician under the distant banyan tree, who spoke of a sanctuary that was not built of physical walls or bodily strength. Aniya began to deconstruct his vigilance, observing how a simple sound in the undergrowth was immediately synthesized by his intellect into a terrifying narrative of survival. He saw that the fear was not in the sound of the wind, but in the speed with which his mind projected the ghost of death onto every event. By refusing to feed these imaginary scenarios, he forced his awareness to settle into the raw sensations of his heart pounding. He allowed the fear of dissolution to wash over him without attempting to fight it or run from it. The physical rigidity began to melt, his muscles relaxing into the solid earth, and he understood that the forest was not his enemy. The silence of the Mahavana deepened, not because the wild had stopped its movements, but because the hunter inside him had finally laid down his arms. The light of the fading day filtered through the leaves in quiet beams of emerald and gold, and he sat as a simple part of the woods, neither defending his flesh nor fearing the earth's embrace. His breath became deep and slow, echoing the great sigh of the wind in the branches, completely free from the cage of anticipation. He observed how his entire life had been a series of elaborate maneuvers designed to escape the inevitable reality of bodily impermanence. Every step in the wilderness had been motivated by the defense of his physical form, a constant striving that made true rest impossible. In this quiet clearing, he saw through the core illusion of his self-preservation instinct, understanding that the body was merely a temporary configuration of organic elements, borrowed from the forest and destined to be returned to it. This realization brought an immense wave of physical and mental relief, as if a heavy structural cage had been dismantled from around his chest.